In 1858, a Sunday school teacher by the name of Mr. Kimball led a Boston shoe clerk to give his life to Jesus. The clerk was Dwight L. Moody, who became an evangelist. In 1879, while preaching in England, the heart of a pastor named F.B. Meyer was set on fire, who later came to an American college campus to preach. Under his preaching, a student by the name of Wilbur Chapman was saved, and he engaged in YMCA work and employed a former baseball player named Billy Sunday to do evangelistic work. Billy Sunday held a revival in Charlotte, North Carolina, and because the revival stirred the hearts of many, some 30 businessmen wanted to devote a day of prayer for Charlotte. So in May of 1934, a farmer lent the men some land to use for their prayer meeting. The leader of the businessman, Vernon Patterson, prayed, "Out of Charlotte, the Lord will rise up someone to preach the gospel to the end of the earth." The businessman then called for another evangelistic meeting, asking this fiery southern evangelist to shatter the complacency of these church-going people from Charlotte. The farmer who lent his land for the praying meeting was Franklin Graham, and his son Billy became a Christian during the meeting. All I can say is, wow, is that a coincidence? Who would have ever dreamed or imagined that because a Sunday school teacher told a young man about Jesus, it would in turn out the likes of someone like Billy Graham? Now, is that luck or what? If it's not fate, then I don't know what it is. I mean, come on. What else could it be? How about your life? Are there a series of events in your life that may appear as just chance or luck? That's exactly what the world wants us to believe about such events in our lives. It's all just luck, they say. Many would have us believe such a thing as these. They make these comments. The view that all things are determined by an untouchable law of cause and effect. In other words, it's just fate. Or they propose this, the idea that God created the world, but then he withdrew from the day-to-day caring of it. Or they go on and say, I think it's the view of two opposing forces in the universe, and they're locked in this struggle with each other for control. Is that, as Christians, is that what we believe life comes down to? An order of fate by an uncaring higher power who is struggling to gain control of the universe? Well, the book of Ruth that we're studying and the rest of the Bible has something different to say about the everyday events and circumstances that we happen to find ourselves in and how God works within these everyday events. We're studying the book of Ruth this month. And as we're doing the second chapter, I want us to consider how you as mothers, or your mothers, relate so much to Boaz, or maybe so much to Ruth, as we go through this. What happened last week? Naomi and the husband and two sons moved to Moab because there was a famine in their hometown of Bethlehem. Well, the sons, they married Moabite women. Naomi's husband soon dies, and as does her two sons. So being a widow, she decides to return to Bethlehem. But she encourages her daughter-in-laws to return to their original families so they can have the opportunity to get married again. Well, one does, but not Ruth. She's hopelessly devoted to her mother-in-law. So what does she do? She leaves behind her native land, her language, her culture, and her people that she knows, and she goes with Naomi to Bethlehem. Now this was a great sacrifice on Ruth, because all through chapter 1 you're thinking, oh, poor Naomi. after a daughter-in-law who's going to be going through this culture shock. You're wondering if she'll be more of a burden than anything. But as soon as we get into this second chapter, we see that Ruth is not a slacker and that she has come along to care for her mother-in-law. In the second verse, it says this: "One day Ruth said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the fields to gather leftover grain behind anyone who will let me do it.' And Naomi said, 'All right, my daughter, go ahead.'" What this was a reference to the practice back then of called gleaning. According to the Hebrew law, a landowner, a farmer, was required to leave part of his crop in the field so that poor people could come in after the official harvest was done and do their thing. The gleaners, as they were called, would pick up what was left over. It was their form of a welfare. For example, here's what it says in Leviticus. "When you harvest your crops, do not harvest the grain along the edges of the field, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. It is the same with your grape crop. Do not strip every last bunch of grapes from the vines, and do not pick up the grapes that fall on the ground. Leave them for the poor and the foreigners who live among you, for I, the Lord, am your God." God has given each one of us a harvest. God has given us success in our business. So make sure that we leave something for the less fortunate. This is how that society looked out for the poor. And they didn't consider it charity. It was not a nice thing they did for people. Quite frankly, it was the law. And those who had were obligated to look out for those who had not, regardless of the circumstances as to why they became poor. Now notice, though, it wasn't a total handout. They had to come in and actually pick up the leftovers themselves. They had to put some energy into it. They had to work also. So this is what's happening in the second chapter of Ruth. Ruth says to her mother-in-law, "How about if I go glean in some fields and get some grain so we'll have something to eat tonight?" Apparently Naomi may not have been strong enough to do that kind of work, or she probably would have already been out there doing it. This again points to Ruth's compassion. She's under no social obligation to her mother-in-law. But she's making life happen for Naomi, who had nothing. And this kind of compassion and mercy doesn't escape the notice of Boaz. Speaking to Naomi, and at the risk that I'm going to get too far ahead, in verse 11, he says this: "I also know about the love and kindness you have shown for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers." Now there is a certain irony here that we need to catch. Boaz is heaping the compliments on Ruth, talking about how kind she has been. But there's nothing in the story, especially in chapter 2, to suggest that he had any ulterior motives, that he was going to try to hit on Ruth. He's generally impressed that Ruth's not so random kind of acts of kindness. But the irony is that Boaz himself is about to outdo Ruth in his mercy and his compassion. And he does it without even thinking about it. We're introduced to him first at the beginning of the chapter in the first verse. And it says, "Now there was a wealthy and an influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech." Now this is going to turn out to be a very important bit of information as we get further into the story. For as a relative of Naomi's deceased husband, he is a potential kinsman redeemer. And we'll talk about that more in the weeks to come. It just happens that Ruth is gleaning in a field, though, that belongs to this relative of her late husband. Apparently, even though he has heard of Ruth and what he has done for Naomi, up to this point he really hadn't actually met her. For when Boaz goes out to the field to check and see how everything's going at the harvest, he notices this new girl in the field. He says to his foreman, he says, "Well, who is this girl?" And the foreman replied, and this is in the 6th and 7th verse. It says, "She is a young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest over there in the shelter." Boaz continues on in the 8th verse, goes over to Ruth and says, "Listen, my daughter." This, by the way, tells us that Ruth is significantly younger than Boaz. "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the women working in my fields. See which part of the field they are harvesting, and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to bother you. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." See, Boaz is giving her permission to get even closer behind the harvesters than normally allowed. And he speaks to the male harvesters to make sure they don't bother her. "Move in close and don't worry about the guys. They've been warned to keep their paws to themselves." And on the top of that, he invites her to share their water. This is way above what Boaz was obligated to do for any foreign woman gleaning in his field. And then, in the 14th verse, at lunchtime, Boaz called to her, "Come over here and help yourself to some of our food. You can dip your bread in the wine if you like." So she sat with his harvesters, and Boaz gave her food, more than she could eat. As a matter of fact, it says later in the story that she took a doggy bag of lunch food home to Naomi that night. So are we starting to get a picture of the kind of man Boaz is? Kind of reminds you of your mother, doesn't it? Boaz blessed Ruth for taking care of her mother-in-law. It was a kind and considerate thing to do. She was working hard to provide for the two of them, so Boaz prayed a blessing on her hard work because he recognized Ruth's sacrifice as a godly one. It says, "May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full of the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." Now, obviously, God doesn't have literal wings, but it's an expression of God's security and protection that he offers his children. As a mother bird protects her young by spreading her wings over them, the Lord protects his people. And the answer to this question can be found in the gentle care of Boaz for Ruth. It's a beautiful model of the gentle love of God. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men. He said, "Let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her. Matter of fact, pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up and don't give her a hard time." That is, make sure that you leave some extra good stuff for Ruth to collect in her basket. God doesn't do all the work for us, but you will find that when we honor the Lord in our workplace, he rewards us with extra blessings or gleanings. This guy is extravagant in his generosity. So much so that when Ruth meets up with Naomi at the end of the day, she rides home with this semi-truckload of grain. Well, maybe not exactly that much. It says that so Ruth gathered barley all day, and when she beat the grain that evening, it came out to about half a bushel. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the food that was left over from lunch. "So much," Naomi explained. "Where did you gather all this grain today? Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you." Put this whole thing in context, and you see this is really about God's generosity extended to Ruth and Naomi. And ultimately, later on, we're going to find out to Israel and the world. God is behind the unfolding of this story of mercy and compassion, which is in paradox, because in chapter 1, what happened? Naomi was convinced of what? That God was out to get her. God was out to do her in. But here, in chapter 2, the curtain starts to open a bit. The light of hope starts to shine a bit. And suddenly, we realize that the Lord is behind it all. And there's most certainly the beginning of this human love interest between Boaz and Ruth. But behind the scenes of this developing story, it is God who is romancing Ruth to get a relationship with him. A romance for a hopeful heart. Is there a Boaz in your life who is demonstrating to you very tangible ways the love of God? Take time now to thank God for reminding you of his love through this special person. And if you don't have a Boaz in your life, will you ask God to bring you one? Now, maybe more importantly, are you acting as a Boaz to somebody else so that they may see Jesus in you? Because you see, what we say and do is a reflection of who we are and what our values are. If we have been changed by the grace of God, that should show. And if it's showing, it's going to cause a reaction out of people, both good and bad. Therefore, we are ambassadors. As through God, we're making an appeal through us, we beg you on behalf of Jesus to be reconciled to God. God wants to use every Christian as a Boaz to a wandering Ruth out there. Can you think of any Ruths in your life? What are you going to do about it? Ruth says to Boaz in verse 10, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?" Think about that a minute. Ruth had the right attitude. It's an attitude that we should all have before God. Why should you give your grace to me, O God? I'm a foreigner. I'm a stranger. But thank you for including me under the gentle care of your wings. I wonder if there's anybody that you know of that's not under the wings of God. Maybe there's somebody who's struggling very hard in life without the blessing that God freely offers. God is calling you to help them find the shelter under his wings. Maybe there's somebody out there that feels left out, forgotten, maybe even forsaken. Maybe they've drifted in their faith. They've lost touch, even turned their back on God. Is God calling you to help them come back to find shelter under his wings? We thank you, God, for first noticing us, desiring that we stay close to your family. We thank you for protecting us. We thank you for providing living water and bread for us. And we thank you for the blessing of the work that's in our hands. And we thank you for the mothers, both those that are raising kids and our mothers that raised us. Amen. Let us stand.